This is a Heart and Hand production.
Good evening and welcome back to the Scout Report on Heart and Hand. I am your host, Adam Thornton, and today I'm joined by Simon Edwards. Simon, great to have you on the show. As I said to you off air, I've been a follower of yours for a number of years. Do you want to give everyone a bit of background on who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I've been living and working in Colombia for almost 15 years now in total. So I've been here quite a long time, working as a journalist on South American football. Also been working with agencies and players more directly recently. So yeah, very happy to talk about Cifuentes, a player I first saw in January 2019. So I've seen him a little few years and a player I'm a fan of. So it'll be interesting to talk about him today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jose Cifuentes has been linked, rumoured for Rangers for a number of weeks now. It probably felt like it was closer than we thought a couple of weeks ago. There was a lot of interest in it and it felt like it was done. We're not quite sure where it stands just now. We're maybe at a bit of an impasse in terms of haggling for fees, etc. I know his contract is up in the winter over there, so maybe there's a pre-contract that's going to happen. But he has been heavily linked. Rangers do need a central midfielder. What type of player would we be getting? I want to talk about kind of where he's came from, his background, etc. But what type of player right now do you think Rangers would be getting if he was to sign?
Yeah, I think he's interesting because on the face of things, when you first look at him, he's kind of like a Patrick Vieira kind of midfielder. You know, he's tall, he's elegant, he's physical, he's quick, box to box, and obviously a very strong kind of defensive presence as well. Throughout his career, he's played basically as a 6, an 8 and a 10. More recently with LAFC, he's playing between the attack and the midfield, kind of as a transitional player. He's very good on the ball, very good, very composed, very comfortable at receiving under pressure. I'd say that's one of the key factors with him. He's also quite creative as well. Often you see these very physical players with a physical advantage, and that's kind of what defines them. But increasingly, he's been putting up good creative numbers, getting forward. So I think what you have is a player who can play anywhere in midfield, is at least a 7 out of 10 in every kind of aspect of a central midfielder, in terms of his defensive contribution, in terms of his progressive passing, his ball carrying, and his overall athleticism. So I think a very versatile player who does a bit of everything, and I think he could fit very well in terms of that, the UK type of football.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about the sort of country profile in South America. I always think of Colombian, Ecuadorian midfielders as being that more sort of physical nature compared to maybe an Argentinian or a Brazilian one. So I was quite surprised when I watched him to see just how good he was on the ball, how far forward he gets. So in that way, he's maybe a bit of an all-rounder then, you could say, and someone that could probably slot into any type of system.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think also it's important to look at how Ecuadorian football's developed and how he's a product of that. So that Ecuador team going back to 2019 was a team that played on the front foot, was assertive, that pressed. But what was so impressive is how all of their players could receive under pressure. And even if, for example, they were playing like a 4-4-2, they were playing quite, the midfielders were quite isolated, but they were always happy to take the ball even under quite considerable pressure and work their way out, whether it would be using their physicality, their technical ability, passing, just the confidence and the instinctive nature of Cifuentes and a few of other players on the ball was really impressive. So yes, he has the lungs, he has the energy, he has the strength and the speed. But I think what sets him apart from some other players is his ability to find solutions and to turn on the ball, to progress the ball, and to get it into the final third.
I think that's really interesting, that skill set for us. We've spoken for a bit about the Rangers midfield, where we had lots of deeper line passers. We sometimes played 3 of them at the same time, but we sort of lacked that dynamism, those vertical runs to get up there and get on the end of balls. We had a couple of players who would do it. Maybe Scott Arfield, who has left us in the summer. One player that we did bring in was John Lundstrom a couple of years ago, who to me seems like a similar type of player, maybe box to box in that sense, maybe doesn't have the attacking output of Cifuentes. And one thing he said was he struggled with the fact that at Sheffield United, he's maybe used to getting 30 or 40 passes or 30 or 40 touches of the ball, whereas at Rangers, you're talking 70 or 80 touches on the ball for central midfielders. LAFC are a dominant team within MLS, I think, certainly over the last season or two. So I don't really envisage much of an issue there for Cifuentes. Like you said, he is very good on the ball and very composed.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I think what you can do with him is, if you are playing him, for example, more advanced, whether you play with 2/8/10s or if you play him as a 10, he'll be very effective at the first line of the press. You know what I mean? So he'll be closing off, preventing those passes into midfield. He's very technically kind of aware, very tactical in that regard. So I think not only his quality on the ball will be an important factor, his ability in the transition, but also in terms of leading the press. And if Rangers want to play on the front foot, then he's someone who can give you that creative aspect, but also can prevent the opposition doing anything other than lumping it forward. And obviously, Rangers will expect to kind of be dominant with those long passes. So I think that's an important factor as well. And he's a bit of a leader. He takes responsibility for the game. He's confident. So I think he could be an important presence. And as I say, an 8/10, I think, is kind of where you can play. So, for example, if they wanted to play with a 6 and then 2 8s, but pushing on a lot, that would suit him well. Or he could be the 8 or the 10. And again, I think you probably lose some of his dynamism, his energy, and his ability to drive forward if you play him as a 6. But in terms of sitting in front of the ball and getting on it and passing, he's also quite comfortable doing that as well.
Brilliant. Okay, that's good to know. A real all-rounder then. In terms of his journey then, you mentioned you've been following him for a number of years now. I remember him being linked with Celtic a good few years ago, and then maybe latterly with some Premier League clubs in the last couple of years. Was it a surprise to you that he went to LA in the first instance? Was it a surprise that he never made it over to Europe? Do you know of any reasons for that at that stage?
I think the attitude towards Ecuador has changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 years. Obviously, the likes of Moises Caicedo, Estupiñán, these guys in the Premier League. So I think perhaps Brighton of today might have pulled the trigger quicker and just sign him straight away. But I don't think at the time there was as much confidence in players coming straight from Ecuador. So he really shone at the under-20 South American Championships. And then he didn't move to LAFC until a year later, more or less. So the fact that nobody pulled the trigger in those 6 months is probably why the US, because US clubs obviously don't have as many options as European clubs. So when they find a player they like, they're more likely to be proactive and kind of put a little bit of money. I mean, I think it was like 1.5, 1.7 million, the move to LAFC. So not insignificant, but also not a huge amount of money. I think the fact that he hadn't moved a little earlier and it was just the fact that LAFC pushed strongly for him and came through. But yeah, it's been a good move for him, and I think he's settled into a new culture, a more physical kind of end-to-end dynamic football, which should set him up quite well for a move to Europe.
No, it should certainly set him up well for Scotland. That's one thing he's going to have is a bit of a physical challenge, so that's good to know. One thing Rangers have done over the last year or so, I guess, is we've had a look at players who contracts are running out, I should say. So last summer we signed Rıdvan Yılmaz from Turkey, and then in the January transfer window we signed Nico Raskin and Todd Cantwell, who had 6 months to go in their contracts. Seems to be something that we're sort of trying to identify, whether it's players that have maybe lost their way a little bit or players that are coming to the end of their contract before they get to that sort of Bosman spell and we get blown out of the water with the wages. Feels like the same thing here with Cifuentes. He's free to sign a pre-contract in the 1st of July, I think it is, and his contract would run out in the summer, the winter, as I said. In terms of open market, for a player like that who's on the fringes of the national team, who's playing in the MLS, who's got that sort of background, what would you be expecting if he had a couple of years left in his contract as a kind of estimated transfer fee? Yeah,
it's still a little bit. It's not a path that's been particularly well tread, obviously, because he's 24 now, so he's still got 10 years, at a good level. So I think it's important that he gets the right move now. I think that's obviously why the Cifuentes wasn't keen to renew, so he could open up the opportunity to make sure there's nothing in the way of a move to Europe at this point, and that definitely feels like it's the case. So I think, I think, look, if he had 5 years in his contract, we're thinking 4, 5, 6 million is a fair number. But again, it's a case of seeing which clubs would pay that, because he's a player who doesn't have experience in Europe. So I think this makes a lot of sense for Rangers, because you're getting a player who in a year's time you could sell to the Premier League. very easily. But it will be and get a lot more money than LAFC could get, even if he had years on his contract, just because he would have that experience in Scotland. So in terms of obviously LAFC, there's the language there, so he'll picked up some English, but it's Los Angeles, everyone speaks Spanish, or a lot of people speak Spanish, so it's not going to be. It's kind of a decent step to go to the US and then go on to Scotland. And if he can do it in the US and he can do it in Scotland, then again, a year and a half time, then there's no reason a big Premier League club, 25 years old, there's still a big transfer there in the future if he does well for Rangers, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of his international experience, then he obviously isn't a first pick for Ecuador at the minute. He is very much within every squad, I believe, but there is quite a sort of growing number of Ecuadorian players who are starting to come to the fore, as we've seen in the World Cup. Do you see him sort of barging his way in there to maybe be a partner with Moise Caicedo, or is that something that he's maybe a little bit away off? Yeah.
No, I think depending on the situation, depending on the game, he can definitely start for Ecuador. It's just a case of whether they want. So they've often played kind of two central midfielders, Moises, and kind of a more conservative sitting midfielder, and then a 10 in front. So I think Cifuentes' versatility in some ways kind of works against him in that system because they want to have that cover. They want to free up Moises to do what Cifuentes would like to do. But in terms of just raw ability, I would say he's definitely one of the three best central midfielders in Ecuador. It's just a case of enabling a very much creative, foot on the ball, slow, dictating midfielder or a defense midfielder. It's just getting the right balance with Moises. But he's definitely alongside Moises in that midfield if you just pick the best three midfielders in Ecuador.
I guess that's the thing about international football, isn't it? You can't pick the style of midfielders that are going to come through, so there needs to be a little bit of a balancing act there. So that makes sense. Okay. In terms of the wider South American football, then you're obviously an agent out of there. You live in Colombia. There have been a lot of changes in the last couple of years with Brexit in terms of players moving to the UK. You mentioned Brighton have been early adopters there in terms of getting the South Americans into UK. What have you noticed over the last couple of years then in terms of those changes? Is there something that you can share with us, a little bit of insight that maybe Scottish clubs haven't quite cottoned onto yet?
Yeah, 100%. So I think the official automatic pass appeals panel, so it's if you get 15 points, and points are accumulated from national team appearances, from league appearances, from Copa Libertadores, Copa Sudamericana. So you can get points for all these different things. Basically, if someone's playing in the Libertadores, the Champions League equivalent, then that's an automatic pass pretty much in most situations. Some national team games get you an automatic pass depending on the FIFA ranking of the country. But it's basically, if you're a Colombian international or a South American international, there's a very good chance you can now go to Scotland with very few questions asked. Yep. If you get over 10 points, it's an appeals process. But the feeling at the moment is even less than that 10 points is possible, particularly in Scotland, on a special talent exemption. Obviously, it's a little easier to demonstrate someone's a kind of exceptional talent in Scotland than it would be in the Premier League. So there's definitely potential for Scotland to potentially pick up some players that are close but not quite there with the visa for England, for example. But I think it's an interesting one. And there's also talk of these rules being relaxed further and a few more exemptions, one or two players who don't fit within that requirements. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity because, again, you're not going to get Brazilians, you're not going to get Argentines who are playing in the first division to come to Scotland unless it's Rangers or Celtic who are putting some money behind it. But you can take your pick from Venezuela under-20s national team, for example, or many of the Colombian national team under-20 players. Ecuador, there's a good number of players there who will go to Scotland. And I'm not even just talking about Rangers. Someone like Hearts, for example, could pick up some of these guys, and it will be really interesting. Now, obviously, there's still resistance, and this has been something I've been pushing for 3 or 4 years, and sometimes it comes down to sporting director loves him, the president loves him, but the manager's like, maybe we get someone from League Two who's a bit of a journeyman. So there's always that resistance, and I do understand. But I think as well, sometimes the questions are like, will he be able to, it can be tough. The weather's not great. Will he be able to adapt? And I do understand that question, but it's like, if you're from South America, you probably left your family at 12, 13 years old to travel across the country, walking 2 hours to get to training every day. You know what I mean? So these are tough young people, often from very difficult backgrounds. So they're motivated, they're hungry, and obviously the potential is there for them to do very well. But it is a process. And if you bring a South American, you need someone who speaks Spanish. You need to have the infrastructure in place. But I think in terms of a lower mid-table Scottish team, they're not going to compete with Rangers and Celtic consistently. But if they get it right for 1 or 2 seasons, they could get, they could be in with a shout until the player gets picked off. But they're not going to do that if they buy, from the Scottish Championship or League One or League Two in England. So I think there's definitely a potential, but it's obviously a risk, and it requires some additional scouting. It requires some additional infrastructure, additional investment in terms of making sure that they're comfortable. But yeah, I mean, you get one of those players, you sell them for 10 million, that sets you up for years in terms of a lower level Premier team in Scotland.
I can't let you go without talking about Alfredo Morelos. Obviously, the came from Colombia. That was an interesting path then. So I guess that pathway that he had to take, if you like, moving to Finland before coming into Scotland, that then negates that middleman. Now there's the opportunity there that clubs such as Rangers or whoever can go and get. I don't know how much HJK paid for Morelos. I don't think it was huge amounts. So that's a good example then of that step that has now been taken away with these new rules.
Yeah, I think Morelos would have got, because the UK is more difficult than the rest of Europe, apart from maybe Holland. Holland is the other one, which is a little bit tricky. In Holland, the visa is based upon salary, and it has to be significantly higher than the average salary in the league. So again, that means PSV and Feyenoord can take their pick, and no one else can buy anyone else. But in terms of Morelos, I think he probably would have qualified for the UK under the current rules because he was playing for the Colombia under-20 national team. Okay. So that would be important. And yeah, 100%. I mean, the Colombian First Division, very few young strikers get consistent minutes. There's actually more players coming from the second division in Colombia direct to Europe. So, for example, Cabezas went to Watford. So very few players in the Colombian top flight. So there's a lot of players who could be available for a few thousand, a percentage of future sale, which is always an attractive option for Colombian clubs because they won't get the fee that perhaps they feel they deserve, but they send him off and they get the money in the future. Envigado made millions from James joining Real Madrid, and that was 3 transfers down the line, but they kept 20%. So 20% of 80 million is much more than whatever they could get for a 17-year-old back in the day. So
that's pretty clever. Yeah,
100%. I mean, there's plenty of players available, and it's a conversation that agents are having at the moment with Scottish clubs, and it's a process. But I think it will just take 1 or 2 examples of someone coming straight from South America and turning Hibernian into a power for a year or so, and then everyone will be ringing my phone and everybody's phone looking for the next one. So Morelos has definitely opened up some possibilities, but I think going direct from South America to Scotland, and then I think there's a lot of potential there because the work permit is easier and it's seen as a very good stepping stone to England, for example. So I mention Morelos whenever I speak to players, to agents about Scotland. It's like, you could be the next Morelos, and that's powerful in terms of this side, and obviously it's an interesting opportunity for Scottish clubs as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because Celtic obviously have had a number of Japanese players coming in, and then we started to see over the last couple of windows, I think Hearts had a Japanese player, and I think Motherwell might have had one as well. So it's kind of interesting. You can see the agents at work there. I think trying to place the clients. All you need is a couple of examples to go with. Obviously, Morelos maybe a little bit different because he was just here so long and he was the only Colombian at Rangers, I guess, at that time. But if we start to get a few through, I think we can start to see that happen. Plus with the new relaxing, like you said. So that's interesting. Okay, so in terms of Cifuentes, then is there anything else you feel like we should know about him in terms of his character, anything like that you could share with us before we go?
No, he's a good guy. He's professional. There's never been any issues. Family man. You sometimes have rumors of South Americans being a bit wild, and there's been no indication of that at any point in his career. So I think you'll get someone who's very serious, very professional, has obviously spent years and years now in the US in a very, very serious environment, very high quality training facilities. He works hard in the gym. All these things that kind of are important factors when you're coming into a team. So I think you get someone who's fairly quiet, but he's kind of a leader. He's responsible. He looks to take control of the game. So yeah, I think it's a really, really smart signing, not only for right now, but there's definitely another potentially big move if he comes in and settles in the future as well, which is which is always nice. Also, we'll see how it goes.
Fingers crossed it gets done and we don't end up with egg in our face after bigging up for Rangers. But yeah, as you said, he's just turned 24 a few months ago, so he's very much in that category of come in and deliver now. The strategy for Rangers has to be get 2 years out of these guys, I would say, and get them moved on and try and find the next one. Unfortunately, that's where we are. We can't do it with every player, but we certainly need to try it because we have been stung a little bit with Morelos and Ryan Kent coming in and doing very well and thinking we're going to get all these millions, and it doesn't quite transpire. So I think we're all keen to get good players in that would deliver trophies and silverware first of all, but we also have to keep thinking about that player trading model. Simon, thank you very much for joining me. It was a pleasure to have you on.
No, you're very welcome. Actually, the last time I did something just like this was with a Man United podcast, Man United YouTube channel, and it was about Moises Caicedo and how he was going to be the best signing they ever make, and he's going to be amazing. So I was proven correct, even though Man United dropped the ball on that one. Yes. So hopefully Cifuentes gets done and you can enjoy him for next season.
Hopefully we can. Thank you very much for coming on.
That was a Heart and Hand production.